Tumult continued in South Africa between races, this time in Ciskei, one of several self-governing territories known derogatorily as Bantustans. Ciskei, populated mostly by Xhosa people, had been subject to a coup d'etat in 1990 and was ruled by Defence Force Brigadier Upa Gqozo as a dictator. With the dismantling of apartheid, the whole raison d'etre of the homelands was disappearing, but Gqozo showed no signs of wanting to rejoin South Africa. An ANC-organised protest of some 80,000 people, led by Cyril Ramaphosa and white activist Ronnie Kasrils, marched on the Ciskei capital of Bisho, current population just 11,000, but as they approached, the Ciskei Defence Force cordon around the town, the soldiers opened fire with automatic weapons, killing 28 and injuring over 200. Ironically, the massacre at Bisho seemed to reinvigorate the stalled democracy negotiations in South Africa, as Nelson Mandela met with F.W. de Klerk again in the aftermath to discuss what could be done about Gqozo, and while nothing was decided on that score, the meeting led to the resumption of talks between the two. On the same day as the Bisho massacre, the president of Tajikistan was forced to resign at gunpoint by anti-government protesters. The post-Soviet presidential election in the Central Asian Republic in 1991 had seen the communist candidate Ramon Nabiev elected with over 60% of the vote, a result which had never really been trusted by opposition groups, a loose coalition of pro-democratic, tribal and Islamist groups. Sporadic violence had been endemic since May, but in September, after a week of intensive clashes, opposition forces captured Nabiev and forced him to resign and accept a new coalition government, including members of the opposition. However, with the entire country seemingly on one side or another, and interested parties from outside Tajikistan queuing up to back their preferred faction, it didn't look like the small nation's problems were done with just yet. Incidentally, anyone familiar with Neil Stephenson's influential cyberpunk book Snow Crash might recall that Tajik immigrants, Jeeks, are a significant minority in the fractured US of the story. It was written around this time. There had been a FOCA test at Monza between races, where Damon Hill had been put to work testing the FW14B, while Mansell and Patrese continued contract negotiations. Just before those tests, though, Honda had made the announcement everyone was expecting that they would be pulling out of F1 at the end of the year. There were a number of cited reasons. Honda had achieved about all that could be achieved in F1 over the last few years. The global economic downturn was hitting the car industry, and increasing environmental consciousness meant that economy and green technology were now considered more important to the company than high performance. Nonetheless, a monitoring group would be left in place to keep an eye on developments, and of course, sister company Mugen was still in the sport, supplying footwork and possibly taking on one or more other teams for 1993. So, with Honda on their way, and Ayrton Senna presumably following them out of the door, Ron Dennis had a lot of work on over the next 3 months. He needed 2 drivers and an engine deal, and he needed them quickly. Ron and moneyman Mansour Ojay spoke to Guy Ligier, apparently, offering him $20 million for the team as a going concern, as a way of getting their hands on the team's Renault V10 engines. Guy Ligier was interested. He was beginning to get fed up of the team's constant underperformance and was now having to fend off hostile takeover bids too, but Renault objected. They weren't interested in supplying a third team, and at any rate they had an exclusive deal with Elf Fuels while McLaren were tied into using Shell, so that was a non-starter. So, off to Dearborn to talk to Ford, and they took the opportunity to announce one part of their 1993 puzzle. Michael Andretti would be joining the team to replace Gerhard Berger. A huge star in IndyCar, where he'd won the 1991 title and was currently fighting to defend it from Bobby Rahal, Ron hoped that the announcement would help McLaren get in with Ford. Mike Cranafus was open to the idea of supplying McLaren, but reminded Dennis that they had a works deal with Benetton, so it would have to be on a customer basis. Some within F1 were sceptical of Michael Andretti's credentials for making the switch. IndyCar and F1 were quite different disciplines in many ways, and Andretti had only had a couple of private test sessions. Ron Dennis assured everyone that Michael will learn quickly. I have confidence in his professionalism. Over at Williams, things were also not going brilliantly. Mansell hadn't spoken to Frank since Budapest, and it seemed clear that the two were just irreconcilable over money. Depending on who you listen to, Mansell was asking for an exorbitant amount to reflect his new champion status and Williams refused, or Williams wanted him to take a substantial pay cut and Mansell refused. Riccardo Patrese, for his part, had been announced as a Benetton driver for 1993 and would replace Martin Brundle, as Michael Schumacher confirmed that he would be staying with the team. Martin's unceremonious dismissal came as a shock to many, since he'd been close to Schumacher most of the time. Qualifying performance was given as the reason, but internal politics at Benetton also played their part. Tom Walkinshaw, Martin's champion, was in financial difficulties, and the British Racing Drivers Club had refused to buy his chain of garages, and he was only saved from bankruptcy when Ventuno Investimenti, a Benetton subsidiary, bought 50% of Tom Walkinshaw Racing. So his man was out, and the Italian was in. Brabham hadn't been saved from bankruptcy, on the other hand, and wouldn't be appearing at Monza while they attempted to find a buyer. And it was also looking like it might be Fondmetal's last race. The cars had been going well, establishing themselves as solid midfield runners, but there was no money. Gabriele Rumi had been funding the team out of his own pocket to the tune of about $12 million, but that couldn't continue. What do you do with sponsors who don't pay up, he lamented. The money was running out too for Gerard Larousse, whose partnership with Venturi was already over, as the Monaco-based luxury car firm abruptly pulled out, leaving ownership of the team shared between American group Comstock, Japanese group Central Park, designer Robin Hurd, who now became head of the board of directors, and the SAG company, owned by one Didier Calmels, Gerard Larousse's former business partner, now released from prison after serving half of his 6-year sentence for killing his wife. On the 8th of September, Bernie Eccleston had asked for and got a ruling from FISA that following the incident in Belgium, the Andrea Moda team were to be ejected from the championship, the first time in history this had happened, for not behaving, quote, in a manner compatible with the standards of the championship, and for, quote, harming the reputation of the championship. So, on Thursday, when Andrea Moda's black transporters arrived at the Monza circuit gates, minus Perry McCarthy as a one-car team, they were turned away by security. Off went Sassetti to the local court to argue that the FISA ruling was unfair, as he'd been acquitted, and the magistrate ruled in his favour, and the team were escorted into the paddock by the Carabinieri. Bernie and Andrea went off together for a chat, and Eccleston said there was no way he was going to let Moreno drive. Back went Andrea to the magistrate, who effectively said, look, I got you into the paddock, the rest is up to you, and that was that. Having not run on Friday, the team left the paddock that evening. I seem to be cursed here, sighed Roberto Moreno, who'd found himself bounced out of his Benetton seat at last year's Italian Grand Prix. It was starting to look like F1 might struggle to fill the grid before long, but there were positive signs too. The new Sauber car had its first shakedown tests at Lurcy-Levy, with Karl Wendlinger and Jean-Louis Schlesser at the wheel, while the successful Pacific Formula 3000 team were also preparing an entry, with Keith Wiggins' team working around the Ford HB engine, though it was not known at this stage if it would be ready for 1993 or put back till 1994. So with no Brabham or Andrea Moda, there was no pre-qualifying, and just 2 cars would miss out on the race. The Ferrari mechanics had been hard at work souping up the engine on Alesi's car to get the most out of it for the home fans, but not Capelli's, of course. But performances had been so bad this year that a paltry 40,000 had turned out to watch the Grand Prix. With nothing to lose now, Mansell was testing a new Renault V10 with sliding trumpets. No, me neither, while Senna had reverted to the standard non-active suspension on his MP47. Mansell complained of a lack of power from the new engine on Friday, though he was still 3/10 faster than anyone else. Back to the regular engine on Saturday, he comfortably took his 11th pole of 13 races so far this year, 6/10 ahead of Senna, who lined up alongside him on the front row. Alesi's souped-up engine powered him to 3rd, with Patrese 4th, citing a lack of grip. Berger was 5th in the active McLaren, with both Benetton suffering understeer, Schumacher 6th and Brundle 9th. Between them were Capelli, who hadn't done badly considering he was not only being ignored by the team, but was also having a hard time getting the hang of the new transverse gearbox, and Thierry Boutsen, who benefited from attending the FOCA test in 8th, while Comas missed out after his crash and could only manage 15th. Gachot lifted the spirits of Gerard Larousse & Co. with a fine 10th spot, ahead of Hakkinen, an impressive Morbidelli, like Gachot benefiting from an upgraded Lamborghini engine, and Johnny Herbert 13th. The Fondmetals were 20th and 25th for what might be their swan song, with Gugelmin bringing up the rear, and the still recovering Fittipaldi and thoroughly demoralised Modena, the 2 to miss out. On Sunday morning, after topping the warm-up times by over 2 seconds, Nigel Mansell called a press conference and, despite some frantic last-minute messaging from Williams, announced that he would be retiring from Formula 1 at the end of the year, his relationship with Williams having broken down completely. The journalists had heard that one before, of course, 2 years earlier at Silverstone, and someone had spotted Nigel and Ron Dennis deep in conversation, while others suggested that if he left Formula One, he might consider going to IndyCar racing, and if Senna was America-bound too, that could be quite interesting. Race day was sunny as the grid assembled after lunch, and Gerhard Berger's mechanical curse hit again as his Honda V12 refused to fire, and the car was dragged off the grid, with the Austrian having to start from the pits in the spare, which had to be quickly altered from Senna's settings. Good news for Ivan Capelli, who now had a gap ahead of him on the grid. When the lights went green, Alesi got away like a scalded cat to take second from Senna, but the Honda V12 power told and the McLaren eased back ahead as they all went into the first chicane. While further back, Schumacher had spun his wheels and lost out to Boutsen, who he tapped at the chicane, damaging the front of the Benetton. So it was Mansell leading Senna, both already pulling away from Alesi, with Patrese fourth, then Capelli, Boutsen and Häkkinen, who'd got past Schumacher round the back of the circuit, with Herbert, Brundle, Comas and the rest following closely behind, and Berger making his way up from last to 21st on that opening lap. As Mansell crossed the line to finish lap 1, Patrese pulled out and took third off Alesi, while Schumacher came in to have his nose replaced and set off at the back to chase down the rest. Mansell, as usual, was set about pulling out a gap from Senna, making it 2 seconds by the end of lap 2, while Patrese took up the chase of the number 1 McLaren, with both Ferraris in the points for a change following. Suzuki's footwork snapped left and wanged the barriers on lap 3. He had Guiar right behind him, but there didn't appear to be any contact, just as Berger was making his way past the pair of them through the midfield. Guiar himself got an unrelated puncture in his right front a couple of laps later, bounced across the Variante Ascari and trailed in for new boots, a new nose, and to remove half a hundredweight of gravel, as the pit reporter Jonathan Palmer put it. And all the time Mansell continued building his lead, and Patrese began to catch Senna. Behind the Ferraris, Brundle had taken 6 off Boutsen, while Häkkinen had already disappeared with an engine failure, so it was Johnny Herbert now in 8th and chasing the Ligier. The Italian director left the camera rolling long enough to watch Comas come past in 9th, then Leto, Gasho, Morbidelli, and Berger passing his old Ferrari teammate Alboreto for 13th. In fact, with not a lot going up front except for Mansell clocking off a string of fastest laps, the director decided to stick with the string of cars from Comas back to Berger, Alboreto and De Cesaris, as Berger set about Morbidelli. Schumacher was also moving up off-screen and was 18th already and rapidly approaching the back of this group, which was reduced by 1 on lap 11 as Gasho pulled in with a terminally sick Lamborghini. Brundle took 5th off Capelli on lap 12, and no sooner had he done so than Alesi also pulled over, his fuel pump having broken, elevating Brundle to 4th. Patrese had by now caught Senna and passed him at the start of lap 14, locking up heavily as they went into the Variante Rettifilo, and then Capelli simply chucked his Ferrari into the gravel under braking for the Parabolica, to the despair of the Tifosi. Alesi was applauded back into the pits by the fans, Capelli not so much, and Monza stands began to empty. So after 15 laps, Mansell led Patrese by 10 seconds, as Berger peeled in from 9th for new tyres after wrecking them charging up the field, and emerged 12th. Senna, meanwhile, was still hanging onto the back of Patrese as the Italian slowly started reeling in a cruising Mansell. Some 17 seconds behind Senna was Brundle, with Boutsen 5th and Herbert 6th, but coming increasingly under attack from Comas as the Lotus's Ford engine was starting to make unhealthy noises. By lap 18, Schumacher was past Leto and then Comas and was bearing down on Herbert and the points, while Naspetti got it all wrong at the first chicane and ended up in a tricky spot for the marshals to remove. Schumacher went up into the points as Herbert's engine went the same way as Häkkinen's. Before the race, Nigel Mansell had agreed with Riccardo Patrese that if the circumstances allowed, he would move over to let Patrese take the win at his home race and help him secure second place in the championship. And duly, he let his teammate pass on lap 20, taking up position behind, but in the process sacrificed his big lead over Senna, so the top 3 were now running close together again as they made their way through traffic. Of course, the pundits had no idea about this, and there was much speculation over what exactly had happened to lose Mansell 13 seconds on a single lap. Schumacher was still charging, lapping quicker than the Williamses, and had arrived on the back of Boutsen once more, the Belgian in the points for the first time this year. Schumacher went through without too much trouble and set off in pursuit of his teammate, who was still plugging away in 4th, some 20 seconds behind Senna and 25 seconds ahead of Schumacher. Guyars-Ilmore went bang on the start-finish straight, and the Frenchman drove a slow lap all the way back round to the pits, dripping oil all the way, and Mansell continued sticking with Patrese, getting into passing spots but then backing off, which only served to confuse the pundits more. With 20 laps to go, the Williams twins were approaching Alboreto to lap him, with Berger and De Cesaris ahead, the Austrian in ninth patiently making his way back up towards the points, with Leto and Comas now ahead of him. The Williamses came past Berger as he was shaping up to pass the Dallara, and soon Patrese was also going past Comas, who accidentally cut Mansell off as he passed, and then lost several places as he braked a bit belatedly, and then spun out further round the lap, having flat-spotted his tyres. Senna, meanwhile, had caught up a bit through all the traffic drama, while further back Brundle had put his foot down a bit, and while not making much impression on Senna, was staying comfortably ahead of his charging teammate. Boutsen, meanwhile, was still hanging on to 6th, but now had Berger gunning for him, followed by De Cesaris, a misfiring Leto, and Alboreto. By now there were just 12 laps to go as the two Williamses continued charging, lapping Gugelmin for the second time and Boutsen for the first, but then on the following lap, Mansell suddenly slowed at the Ascari, his hydraulic pump having seized up and left him stuck in 6th. He trailed in, waving to those few Tifosi left in the stands with whom he remained popular, and retired, with Boutsen also dropping out unnoticed, his throttle linkage gone. Senna, meanwhile, was having a similar problem to the one Mansell had had in Belgium, having thrown in exhaust with his car making a noise like a lawnmower, so Patrese could finally relax and clock off the last 10 laps to his first win of the year. Mansell chatted amiably to Jonathan Palmer in the pits as soon as he got out, explaining the arrangement he'd had with Patrese. He had at least set what would turn out to be the fastest lap of the race, just shy of the lap record. Katayama bounced across the gravel on lap 47, and the lap after that it was Patrese's turn to slow dramatically. His own hydraulic pump had failed, leaving him stuck in 4th. Senna came charging through, though Patrese elected to stay out and see what he could get out of the race. They were dropping like flies now, with Leto out, his Ferrari engine finally giving up the ghost, followed by Gugelmin's gearbox, as Brundle passed Patrese on lap 49 to go second, with the outside possibility of a win if Senna's engine couldn't last the last 4 laps. Senna for his part had backed right off, with Brundle a long way back, which allowed Berger to close back up. Schumacher was past next year's teammate to go third, and as Senna began his last lap he allowed Berger to unlap himself, as the Austrian was also chasing Patrese, who was at this point basically freewheeling round most of the circuit. Senna came home to take his 36th Grand Prix win, a lucky one to be sure, but they all count. Martin Brundle took his best ever finish of 2nd place, if you don't count the 1984 Detroit Grand Prix from which he had subsequently been disqualified, with Schumacher finishing 7 seconds behind his teammate in 3rd. Gerhard Berger took 4th off Patrese on the last lap, with Ricciardo rolling across the line 5th and the last man on the lead lap, and Andrea De Cesaris completing the points in 6th, ahead of Michele Alboreto, finishing 7th, for the 6th time in the last 8 races. Martini was 8th, the only remaining Ferrari runner, with Wendlinger 10th, the only other car still going, though Katayama and Leto had both broken down close enough to the end to be classified. Senna drove his lap of honour in front of what little was left of the crowd, but after the race nobody looked particularly happy. Senna was still glum after the announcement of Honda's withdrawal, and a lucky win by default wasn't enough to cheer him up. Mansell was still unhappy about his situation with Williams and left the circuit without talking to the media. Patrese was devastated at his renewed awful luck, and while Brundle could take a lot of satisfaction from his good result, he'd driven a lonely and boring race and was a bit down in the dumps about his future. Michael Schumacher and Gerhard Berger at least could reflect on good comeback drives, 25th and 26th to 3rd and 4th respectively, and the Benetton team were happy enough with their first double podium of the year, and indeed their first since their 1-2 in Japan in 1990. Patrese's misfortune had dropped him from 2nd to 4th in the championship, with Schumacher going 1 point ahead and Senna equal on points but with 3 wins to Patrese's none. Benetton also moved a point ahead of McLaren into 2nd place in the constructors' race, and with both Ferrari and Lotus having double DNFs, they stayed where they were in 4th and 5th places. Next up in 2 weeks' time was Portugal, always a fun seaside destination to end the European season on.